Good afternoon. Well, good afternoon. Thanks for the very warm welcome. If you make me feel this welcome, I'll come more often. I should tell you, coming up here triggered a flurry of competing entries from my staff pitching us on horse jokes. One proposal was that I compliment the local transit system for how stable it is. There's another suggestion that I offered to support Mackinaw's answer to our high-speed rail proposals with a Seabiscuit 3000 system. We went through a lot of these and then concluded it was best that we all stick to our day jobs, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the preparation. Before I get into the substance of what I'd like to say in the conversation we're going to have, I want to say what a pleasure it really is to be here. This is actually the first time since getting this job that I've had the chance to make an official appearance within driving distance of the house that Chasten and I got near Traverse City a couple years ago, which very much came to feel like a home about 1 year ago, a little less, when we brought home our two newborn twins so they could be close to their grandparents. And like every new parent, it has turned our world upside down. But Northern Michigan was a wonderful place to get up and running with them. And I've always felt a very close connection to this state. I won't channel a former Alaska governor and say that I could see Michigan from my house, but you could in fact see it from the mayor's office window out there in South Bend. And when I was a consultant, my first client assignment was in Detroit. And I have to tell you, it's been extraordinary to see the growth, the investment, and most importantly, the pride that has grown in the heart of that city in the 15 years since I found myself working there. And I know that that is a tribute to so many of the people at this convening and so many of the people in this room. And I believe it's part of the broader and too often overlooked story of how the industrial Midwest has found its way to a more promising future by staying true to its greatest strengths without allowing itself to be held back by nostalgia or any kind of fear of the future. And of course, that's a story that we were very proud of during my time as mayor in South Bend, too. And now that I am in front of you in this new capacity as Secretary of Transportation, I'm mindful that I'm addressing leaders from a state that lives and breathes transportation in so many ways, including, but by no means limited to, the role that this state plays in our nation's all-important auto industry. And I'm here to tell you that this role, this work that so many of you are involved in, connected to our transportation, connected to our infrastructure, has never mattered more. And I'm here on behalf of the Biden-Harris administration to let you know that the American transportation and infrastructure sector now has a level of federal support that we haven't seen in most of our lifetimes. After years and years, decades and decades of so-called infrastructure weeks coming and going in Washington without result, we have finally delivered the basis for an infrastructure decade. And some 6 months since the president signed that bill into law, that infrastructure decade is very much underway. I want to acknowledge Governor Whitmer for understanding the importance of transportation infrastructure from day one of this administration. And frankly, challenging Washington to catch up to the work that state leaders like her have been doing as those infrastructure weeks had come and gone. Matter of fact, she likes to call me the Secretary of Fix the Damn Roads, which sounds about right to me. And as a result of her leadership, now that we have delivered this legislation on the federal level, this is a state that will be exceptionally well poised to take advantage of that infrastructure law, thanks to the running start that you have here. And I especially want to thank the members of the federal delegation here in Michigan, Senator Peters and Senator Stabenow, who played such an important role in crafting the Senate side of the legislation, and the 7 Michigan House members, 6 Democrats and 1 Republican, who supported the bipartisan infrastructure law at a time when a lot of people were skeptical that you could get a bipartisan anything law done in today's Washington. They refused to let it get bogged down in the politics. They refused to give up, and they defied the idea that in today's Washington you couldn't get anything done at all. And I want to thank the Detroit Chamber for your support, because seeing so many sectors across America come together in support of this work, including business leadership and union leadership alike, it's a big part of what made it possible for us to deliver. So let's talk about the state of play. 6 months and counting since the president signed that law on the South Lawn of the White House, we've already put forward $100 billion in funding. We're proceeding swiftly but judiciously to make a reality out of these planned improvements in our roads and our bridges, our trains and transit systems, our ports and our airports, not to mention the water and grid and broadband improvements beyond the transportation portfolio that are going to be so meaningful, especially in states like Michigan. In that period, $3 billion has already been announced as heading to Michigan alone, with more announcements coming as soon as tomorrow. State and local departments are gearing up, calls are going out, bids are coming in, and we are getting to enter the shovel-turning season. We can discuss the programs and the projects in more detail, but I want to do just briefly to frame the conversation is paint a picture of what success looks like. Because for this to succeed, it has to be something that's meaningful, even if you're by no means an infrastructure buff. This isn't about infrastructure for its own sake. This is about producing benefits for Americans that remind us why we care about our infrastructure. Success means that we will have a safer transportation system, saving tens of thousands of American lives. Success means that we will create family wealth for millions of households, both from actually working directly on the improvements as laborers or professionals, and from living in communities that have the cleaner water and the smoother roads and the better rail and air and sea links to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. Success means that we will help to decarbonize the transportation of people and goods, which is a task that represents a large portion of the overall work that America and humanity have to do on climate change in order to save millions of lives and trillions of dollars in property and economic value that will otherwise be destroyed by extreme weather, droughts, floods, and fires. Success means America will be a fairer country, where old patterns of racial exclusion and the exclusion of rural economies in our transportation systems are replaced by a new insistence that those systems help everyone to have a fair shot at thriving. And success in that implementation means that America's position as the world's leading economy will be secure for the balance of this century. Those are the stakes. Those are the opportunities if we succeed. And if we don't, we won't get this opportunity to get again. So success means partnerships at every level. And I'm pleased to report that there have been fantastic alignments and engagements already between different levels of government, different communities, between the public, private, academic, and labor sectors. And that is going to have to continue in order to ensure that our future of transportation is better than anything that we've seen before, with a laser-like focus on getting things done. I am convinced that the 2020s are going to go down in history as one of the most transformative periods ever in U.S. transportation. Our job is to make sure that those transformations not only happen, but they work for all of us, and there's no better place to talk about that than right here. So I'm looking forward to digging into the discussion, and thank you again for having me this afternoon.
Joining Secretary Buttigieg on stage, please welcome Devin Scillian, anchor at WDIV-TV4, NBC.
I'll take the other. Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you here. Really tickled to get to talk to you. It's an interesting thing to talk to you because, as I was explaining to you earlier, even though your purview, of course, is transportation, as the Secretary of Transportation, we have all come to know you as sort of a national political figure, and so you and I are going to talk about some other matters as well. But let's start, if we could, with where we are on some bigger transportation-related issues, in particular the supply chain right now. The supply chain's a hot mess. And of course, critics of the administration believe that it's...
Is that the technical term?
I looked it up, yes. And critics of the administration believe that some of it was, while some of it certainly hasn't been predictable, other portions of it have been, and we just have not reacted well enough. So give me your take on what the supply chain looks like to you.
Well, look, supply chain problems have been building in this country for decades. The underinvestment that went on in every part of our transportation infrastructure left us vulnerable to shocks. And then we had the mother of all shocks in the form of the pandemic. And that's when the supply chain issues began, right? It didn't begin when a certain political party came to power. It began the first week of the pandemic when you couldn't get any toilet paper. And by the end of that year, it was Wendy's not being able to serve burgers at 1/5 of their restaurants because the beef wasn't available. And then it has gone on in one form or another each passing month. And it's a real struggle. So what do we do about it? Well, there's obviously the long-term work that we should have been doing from the 1980s on, and we're doing it now. Tomorrow we'll be announcing rail infrastructure grants that will improve the fluidity of goods movement on rail in 36 states plus the District of Columbia. We have been investing in ports. And I want to emphasize for our supply chains, it's not just the big ones that you see on TV. $52 million that we did for the port of Long Beach, for example, to help them get rail onto the dock. That's very important.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you also the $1.5 million we're sending to Marquette, the 3.7 that's going to Alpena, that are going to mean a lot in these specific regions are also a very important part of how we get goods to where they need to go. So that's the long-term investment we need to make. The truth is we can't wait for a long-term investment to untangle some of the issues we have right now. That's why we're engaging the private sector companies that own and operate most of our supply chains. Remember, nobody wants or needs the federal government to own a shipping company or a warehouse or a trucking operation, right? This is supposed to be private sector. Yeah. But there is a public-private partnership in terms of making sure that it flows. That's why we've taken steps like bringing the different players to the table to exchange data. You wouldn't believe how much data is not shared between the different players in our supply chain, from the ocean shipper to the port to the terminal operator to the rail operator to the warehouse. It's almost, I'm exaggerating a little, but not much. In terms of goods movement, it's almost as if you knew that somebody was coming, you knew that a cousin of yours was on their way to the airport. You knew they were flying in. Mm-hmm. We didn't actually know whether they were going to Traverse City or Pellston, or what airline they were on, or exactly which day they were coming. How would you go pick them up? That's actually a little bit of the dynamic with some of what's going on in our goods movement. We can address that through the sharing of data between these different players. I'm not talking about proprietary data. I'm talking about data that they can and should be sharing, and we're working on that. We're working on pressing the shippers and holding them accountable if they leave their containers sitting around, which is how we cut the number of long-dwelling containers at the coastal ports by more than half. So my point is we've got to couple those short-term measures with these long-term investments so that when we have the next shock, pandemic, weather disaster, war, who knows, that we're more resilient and able to meet it without these kinds of painful experiences.
The short-term measures that we need, I mean, we're in a situation right now where obviously we have a huge problem with inflation, and that is, basically by definition, a lot of dollars chasing too few goods. Mm-hmm. The administration was a little wrong on how long inflation was going to last, how bad it was going to be. Lawrence Summers predicted this morning that we're headed for a recession if we don't suddenly jump interest rates by a lot. I mean, this is all looking rather bleak in the short term even, but that starts to become a long-term problem now. How do we address all that?
Well, first of all, let's look at the shock waves that are still moving through the economy, right? I mean, a big part of how we're here is that we were brought to the brink of a depression just 2 years ago, and have replaced that with some of the fastest job growth that the economy's ever seen, some of the lowest unemployment rates that we have ever experienced. Yeah. And yes, a problem on the supply side keeping up. So we need to invest in our supply side, and I use that term carefully because I mean it a little differently than the way it was used during the Reagan administration. Yeah. But the administration is very focused on making sure we support the productive capacity of this country, whether we're talking about transportation, whether we're talking about workforce, whether we're talking about raw materials, to keep up and to catch up. But there's no question that this is a concern. Our piece of it, transportation-wise, is shipping costs. Keeping those under control because they went through the roof on everything from ocean shipping to trucking. And that's a supply issue. But on all of these pieces, this is a real challenge. Now, I will say that the politicization of it is predictable, but unfortunate. I was just at a meeting of transportation ministers in Germany. A lot of the transportation ministers get together every year and compare notes. And, you know, in the Eurozone, they're seeing 6, 7, 8% inflation. And I was thinking, gosh, it's really striking that some people would think that, you know, the Biden-Harris administration's policies here in Europe have led to inflation here. Look, this is a global phenomenon. That's not to minimize it by any means. It's to make clear that this global phenomenon is something that is not the result of politics, but it does need to be addressed through policy.
Yeah. In fact, we have this weird disconnect. We just did a poll. The Chamber just released a poll yesterday that showed that while everybody's chief concern right now seems to be inflation in the economy, over 70% of the people who responded to the poll said that their own financial situation is better or the same than it was, but that also helps create inflation. If everybody keeps spending and unemployment is very low, then we're on our way to...
Look, that's what pushes prices up, right? People are spending on goods and services and the productive, the supply side. That's why I'm talking about the supply side. But look, for the better part of my political lifetime, jobs and the economy were the same thing. And now we're facing the fact that the economy has to do with jobs, but it also has to do with prices. And that's one of the reasons why the president has made clear that his #1 economic priority right now is the pricing side right now, is inflation.
Let's talk about the price of gas, which of course helps drive a lot of this, but is also bottling up. It makes everything more expensive. We're also, especially the price of diesel, which just keeps rocketing out of sight. How can we address that? We released, you know, a certain amount of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to I guess it depends on how you look at it. Either had no effect or it would have been worse if we hadn't.
I think it is the latter, right? I mean, that's a step that we know can stabilize global oil prices, and the global oil prices are what leads to the gas prices and diesel prices you see at the pump. Although I can't help but mention that when the oil prices go up, the gas prices seem to go up in lockstep. And then when oil prices settle a little bit, this reverse does not seem to be the case. And I think that deserves some attention. But look, bottom line is, folks are hurting. And whether you're an owner-operator truck driver who is already facing a lot of pressure right now, or whether you're just a family trying to have a good Memorial Day weekend, we're all feeling this. And there are two sets of things we can do about this. One is the direct action. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, for example, largest coordinated action ever that the president led in this area. The flexibility around ethanol. The proposals for a use it or lose it policy toward oil companies that are just sitting on these permits, saying we're not going to put those investments in the drill bit, and why would we? We're pretty profitable right now. And saying, okay, well, if you're not producing, then why do you have these permits? Then there's the other side, which is the rest of a family's budget. In other words, of all of the different things that a family pays for in your family budget, some of them can be more directly addressed through policy than others. And some of the things that we could control, frankly, a lot more directly than gas prices, are ones that the president, the administration, and the House have, and a lot of senators are on board with this, but not enough for it to have gotten done, to look at some of these other prices that people are facing to take the edge off. We had a bill move through the House to take insulin to $35, to lower the cost of prescription drugs. We are pushing to lower the cost of housing. We're working to lower the cost of childcare. All of these things would make it so much easier for a family to get by when they are facing these terrible swings in the price of oil and gas.
Let's move to transportation in broader terms. 10 years ago, we might have been hard-pressed to describe the transportation world of today. I'm not sure we understood what Lyft and Uber were going to become. I'm not sure we saw how quickly the automakers were going to try to adapt to the electrification of their fleets. Tell me a little bit about, if you close your eyes and think about what our transportation world looks like 10 years from now, what do you see?
Well, first, we should approach any predictions with a lot of humility for the reasons you just raised, right? Think about one of the lessons of Uber and Lyft. For all the transportation technology that's been developed in the last 10, 20, 30 years, the most important piece of transportation technology of the last decade isn't even a piece of transportation equipment, it's a phone, right? That's what actually changed everything from how you board an airplane to how you summon a ride. And so there's a big unknown factor about some of the changes, but there are some that we can see. Electrification is going to accelerate, and I think it's only going to become more important. The OEMs have made big bets on this, and we need to do it as a country in order to meet our climate goals and in order to make sure that American workers on American soil get the benefit of this electric revolution. And so we're investing $7.5 billion in charging stations. And we've also proposed measures to make those EVs more affordable, so that more families can realize the gas savings that come with owning one. So we know electrification is going to matter. We know automation is going to develop in some very fast-moving, well, let me put an asterisk on that. Fast-moving, but we don't know when some of the fastest movements will happen.
Yep.
Again, we need some humility here. As somebody who started following this issue as a mayor, it feels sometimes as if widespread use of automated vehicles is exactly 10 years away, and it's been exactly 10 years away for 10 years. And so, again, some humility is called for.
It's an extraordinary thing that happens.
But what we do know is we need to update our regulatory frameworks to keep up. Interestingly, there's actually no federal regulation that says you have to have a driver in a car, because nobody ever thought of that. But also, if we're writing a safety standard for a driverless car, right now it says what the airbag should look like in the passenger seat and in the driver's seat. Right. So we're updating even just the language of our most basic regulations. There's a lot of interest in Congress right now on a framework for how we handle automation, not so much to create it, that's what industry's got to do. Yeah. Again, the private sector has its role, but our role is to make sure that it's safe. And by the way, the potential for safety improvements from automation is colossal in a country where human drivers are killing 40,000 people a year.
Exactly.
We should be up in arms about that.
But how will insurance work if I'm willing to turn my car over to the system? Right. Where's the liability?
That's complicated. Yes, that's one of the biggest issues that we've got to work through. And of course, we've got to make sure it unfolds in a way that benefits American workers. And it absolutely could, but that's far from guaranteed. Now, then there are the things that people don't think about a lot in terms of technology and development. And the most exciting, unsexy one that I'm paying attention to is materials. And I know this does not sizzle the way self-driving cars or drones or EVs do. But if you just think about literally how much paving we do, for example, as a country, and how much a hit to the budgets of cities and states that is, if you can make it just a little bit better, and there are amazing technologies right now around recycled material in pavement, porous pavement. There are even solar roadways being developed to see if you can generate energy through these materials. And this is, I think the business minds here in particular should think about this. Right now, the incentives are such that if you're a local or state decision maker, and you were presented an opportunity to have asphalt or another paving material that lasts, let's say, 50% longer in a northern Michigan winter, but you have to pay a 30% premium in order to get it, even though textbook economics says that's a no-brainer, you might actually be compelled to say no because you need to get more done right now, right this year. Yeah. And that's part of what we're trying to address through the improved funding in the infrastructure law, to give people the freedom to think on a longer-term basis, and then let the private sector do what it does best.
So 10 years from now, how much of the driving do you think that we're watching on our roadways is this connected sort of autonomous driving? How much of it is us still doing it the old way?
So I think
in the Pete Buttigieg world that you could build.
I think, the majority of the driving 10 years from now is still certainly going to be people behind wheels. The question is how, in the perfect world that I could build, I actually care less about exactly exactly how the technology works and more just what is the outcome. Yeah. I want a world where we don't have 40,000 people dying every year. If we just stop and think about it for a second. I mean, everyone in this room could close your eyes and picture someone you care about who was killed in a car crash. We're just used to it. It's as if we spent our whole lives in a country at war. Yeah. It doesn't have to be that way. If you look at other countries, they have some of them have dramatically lower rates of roadway deaths than we do. If you look at different parts of this country, some have dramatically lower rates of roadway deaths than others. Yep. We should be working toward a time when dying in a car crash is as quaint and anachronistic as dying of cholera or dysentery. And I think we can get there. And I don't care how, but I think this technology is going to be a big part of it.
Interesting. I drive an electric car, so I'm already in the choir. But I know that every day you hear from people who believe that, A, the push to electrification has gone so fast and so far out in front of what's reasonable that that's part of what's helped create our gasoline problems that we have right now. You also hear continually that this electricity that I'm pouring into an electric car and that other people are is still made largely by fossil fuels. So we're not as green as we look, and we're just kind of kidding ourselves. So all of the foibles that you are presented with, how do you answer that about our drive to be electric? That are we too early for what's really reasonable given how green we want to be?
Yeah, and the answer is no, because we're running out of time. This is not that it's easy. This is a complicated transition. But when somebody says, oh, I'm worried about the raw materials, or I'm worried about the grid, usually that question comes in one of two forms. If it comes in the form of how are we going to fix it, I'm right there with you. If it comes in the form of therefore, let's do the status quo for as long as possible. We literally don't have time. We can't afford to do that. I don't know how more bluntly to put it than the scientists have. But I would also add that a Great Lakes state is exceptionally vulnerable. And you don't have to be next to the water. You could be, well, in Midland, for example, right? Or things like what just happened in Gaylord. Like, there's going to be more of this. And it's going to cost trillions of dollars. And the biggest part of climate, the biggest sector contributing to climate, greenhouse gases, is transportation. And the most actionable part of that is electric. Now, to take a few of these critiques in turn quickly. First of all, is it zero emissions? Well, no. If your electricity is made with fossil fuels,
not
it might
net,
not be.
yes.
But it's getting cleaner by the day, and it is already likely more efficient, even if you're only using fossil fuels, which we're trying to advance away from. It's more efficient, if you just think about it, to take all that fuel in a power plant, turn it into electrons, and then transmit it to a battery, than it is to put it individually in millions of gas tanks and into an engine to set it on fire there and turn it into power. It's just more efficient at utility scale. So that's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about that I think is really important, and one of the reasons I'm excited about what I see in the industry, is that, look, early on, EVs read as this very urban, it's the kind of thing you're sipping your latte, listening to NPR, on your way to yoga, and you're in your electric car. That was the perception, right? But actually, a lot of the biggest wins here in terms of fuel savings are in rural America. Just think about it. First of all, you're driving longer distances, means you're burning more gas, means you're going to save more money if you got an electric car or a truck. And I'm amazed by how many people are still learning about electric pickup trucks.
Yep.
And the truth is the Super Bowl ads will do more than any speech from me on this. But I think as people see that, plus you have the added fact that it is in rural America that people are more likely to live in single-family homes, which means for all this talk about charging infrastructure that makes it sound like a super complicated, obscure thing you got to get your hands on, you already have some. It's the plug in your wall. That's how we charge our hybrid electric minivan. Reluctantly became a minivan dad as soon as the twins arrived.
You'll be all right. And, it happens to all of us. It happens to all of us.
I guess it's inevitable.
Yes.
We plug it in. We'll get a level 2 charger eventually, which will be more efficient, but we just plug it in. So the bigger issue is cost, and that's a real issue. Mm-hmm. Right now, even though your car payment's higher, your gas bill's lower, depending on the vehicle, you may be close to the point of evening out. We got more work to do to bring the cost down. And so anybody who tries to mount a political attack on the subject of EVs being expensive should answer a simple question. When you had the opportunity to lower EV costs through tax credits, did you vote for it or did you vote against it? And we can continue the conversation after getting that answer.
I want to ask you one question about air travel, maybe two, because I never hear a whole lot of advances. I mean, airplanes still seem to run on this. Nobody's talking about, I don't hear a lot of talk about electric planes yet.
Not in the near term.
Not in the near term.
But you got sustainable aviation fuel, which goes into existing aircraft, which is exciting.
That helps. I talked to a friend who works for an airline who said that the U.S. is being obstinate and ridiculous with the pre-testing requirements right now for return to the U.S. surrounding COVID, that the rest of the world has pretty much done away with that, and right now we're in alliance with China as a nation requiring, and that it's putting a real damper on domestic travel has returned, international travel has not. Is it time to get rid of that rule?
So that call sits ultimately with public health folks. It's the CDC working with TSA.
But even the CDC has now made it a 5-day, from the time that you've had, and it's still, I believe, a 2-week quarantine if you test positive before you can come back. I believe that's where it still stands. But anyway,
right.
The overall thing.
So yeah, look, that's a restriction that still gets in the way of travel, and we recognize that. And nobody will be happier than me when we get the clearance to move forward. But of course, the CDC has to get there.
I saw here I had a note that I forgot to get to when we were talking about supply chain issues. We've got a real problem with the driver shortage right now that goes immense implications.
Glad you asked. Well, I guess I didn't let you get to a question.
No, what do we do about that? If unemployment is as low as it is, where are we going to find drivers?
So we got to treat drivers better. That's a really big part of it. We got to treat drivers a lot better. Right now, the industry estimates there's a gap of about 80,000. My department, our BTS, not the BTS that was at the White House yesterday, the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, slightly less famous, but they estimate that we're about 300,000 drivers short, leaving every year, leaving the job.
Yeah.
I was at a port in Newark, and I rode along with a driver. I did it in Illinois a few weeks ago. We need to treat drivers better. They need better parking. That's not just a convenience thing, that's a safety thing for them. We need to pay attention to economic structures where nobody pays for wasting a driver's time. Think about it, because they don't get paid by the hour. I mean, some do, but those who get paid by the load or by the mile, if you're just sitting at a port gate and the port's not organized enough to get you to the berth in 5 hours, or you're sitting at the warehouse and they say, sorry, we're just not ready, or there's not a chassis ready for you.
Or at the Canadian border.
Or you're at the Canadian border, you are eating that cost. If the wheels aren't turning, the owner-operator life can be great, but if the wheels aren't turning, you're not making any money.
Yeah.
So we've launched a partnership with the Department of Labor to look at compensation. We're looking at leasing arrangements. We're looking at recruiting more veterans. We got to get more women into the workforce. And that means taking some specific steps to make sure that it is an appealing and safe job for women drivers who, sexist jokes aside, have statistically every indication of being the drivers we want to make sure that we are bringing into the workforce. And it's insane to be leaving 50% of the talent on the table when we have a worker shortage. I could say that about a lot of sectors, but driving is certainly one of them. We are working on apprenticeships. We've got, I think, up to 100 companies now signed up for apprenticeships to get more people into the pipeline. So we're doing more than we ever have, I think, on recruitment. But it will be a leaky bucket unless we do just as much on retention. That's why we got to treat our drivers better. Everything you're wearing, whatever you ate for breakfast today, maybe even the vehicle that you drive got to you thanks to a truck driver.
A driver.
And if we really mean it when we say they're essential workers, we ought to show it.
Yeah. We've got just a couple minutes left. I want to get to some other issues that are facing us. As I mentioned, we would. You have become, I think, rightly one of the leading voices on LGBTQ issues in America. When we saw the reasoning, and we don't know yet whether it's going to hold from the Supreme Court with the leaked draft opinion, there were some people who were concerned that it showed a roadmap for a rollback of some rights that now we've developed, gay marriage among them. Give me your concerns over what we've gleaned from that opinion.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is really personal. started my day at our wonderful house in Traverse City, and my wonderful husband single-handedly feeding our wonderful kids because I had to get on the road. And thinking about the fact that the very existence of our household, at least legally speaking, came about by the margin of a single vote on the Supreme Court, has you really thinking at a moment like this about the personal stakes of what appears to be a continued push to roll back rights. Look, for as long as we've been, a lot longer than that, I mean, for as long as we've been a republic, we have been on a steady, if uneven, path toward rights and freedoms being expanded rather than taken away. And I think the question that has been raised by the Roe decision, and I understand and grew up with a lot of people who have very strong views on either side of this issue, but at the end of the day, we reached a view as a country that the way we would resolve this very difficult issue is to trust women. And after 50 years, that's apparently being thrown out the window. The broader question that I think is before us now will be, did we live to see the high water mark of rights and freedoms in this country and watch that begin to move in the opposite direction for the first time in history? Or is this a setback on the road toward more secure rights and freedoms for everybody? And you know what side I'm going to be on.
Kind of coming off of what Ted Koppel said we talked about a few moments ago, or as I refer to him, Saint Ted, this division that we have right now, and when you see, I think we are never going to agree on abortion in America. I don't think we're ever going to agree on guns. And as those now are fomenting as two massive issues heading into yet another election, I'm having a crisis of imagination in understanding what it is that brings us all back together again. And can you give me any optimism on that, or are you just as distraught over our divided states of America as I am?
Well, I'm no less distraught, but let me offer some fodder for imagination.
Sure.
I think a lot of the salvation is going to come from the local, first of all. I always believed that when I was a mayor. I believe it even more strongly after becoming a federal official. You look at, I was Mayor Duggan earlier, you talk to local leaders, you see what they're doing, and you see people working on the ground in an environment where you don't have the luxury of retreating to partisan corners. You just have to fill the holes in the road. You just have to get the community through the challenges that it faces. I also believe that the fundamental principles that make America America, however imperfectly we've risen to them over the years, matter, that they're the right ones, that this is a better way to organize a society than some of the other models that are throwing their weight around right now, like China's model. And that's not to bring it all back to transportation. That's part of why we're working so hard on this, because even the deepest, highest-minded issues of democracy versus autocracy come back in some ways to very concrete issues of delivery. This is not the first time that the question has been called on whether democracy is the way to go. As recently as the 1930s, it was fashionable in certain circles of business and political elites in America to start talking approvingly about this fascism stuff going on in Europe. And part of what they used to say, famously, by way of an excuse for Mussolini was, well, he's kind of a rough guy, but he makes the trains run on time. It came back to transportation as an example. By the way, that wasn't true, but we can talk about that another day. So my point is, we need to deliver on some of the basics right now, just for our country to tiptoe back from the brink of the cliff that we have been wrestling alongside, so that we can have more adult conversations about some of the heavier stuff. But let me also offer, and I caught the tail end of what Ted Koppel was saying, and I think it's profound, and I think he's absolutely right. But since he mentioned that kind of dark potential, and thankfully, in his view, at least won't happen in the next 5 or 10 years, but I'm thinking a lot about the middle of this century, when I'll be getting ready to retire, and my kids will be, I guess, of kind of young professional age, when I think we really will have decisively gone one way or the other. And since we've seen a vision of what going off the cliff looks like. Let me offer the other side of that. The world has never actually seen a large-scale, fully functioning, fully inclusive, multi-ethnic, multiracial, democratic republic that represented everybody. We've never actually had that all the way, but we could. And I believe that will happen for humanity if and only if we deliver it here in America. And if we can figure out how to do it, which does mean building trust, it does mean taking care of the basics, and it does mean transcending these divisions of this moment. But if we can do it, that will be as big a contribution to humanity as 1776 was. And we could be the ones who actually brought it about. So that's my best shot at imagination about what the other side of that coin looks like.
Ladies and gentlemen, Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much.